My mother told me my wedding could wait for my sister Emily's engagement party. My father told me my wedding was just a party, and I should not be selfish. I whispered that I understood and hung up the phone. 3 hours later, my mother was screaming into my voicemail. My husband simply smiled because they had finally searched his name online. My name is Roxanne, and I am 31 years old. I work as a forensic accountant investigating corporate fraud. I have spent my entire life being pushed aside for my younger sister, but the day they told me to cancel my wedding was the day I finally stopped trying to earn their love. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who completely underestimated your worth. I stood on a small velvet-covered pedestal in the center of an exclusive bridal boutique in downtown Atlanta. The air in the room smelled faintly of lavender and expensive perfume. The seamstress was kneeling at my feet, carefully pinning the hem of my silk wedding gown. The dress was a masterpiece of quiet elegance. It had long sleeves, a high neckline, and an open back that draped perfectly across my shoulders. Julian had insisted I spare no expense for the dress. He wanted me to feel like a queen on our special Saturday. We were planning an intimate ceremony at a breathtaking private estate tucked away in the countryside. My parents thought we were just going to the local courthouse to sign papers. I never corrected them. I had learned a long time ago that sharing the beautiful details of my life with my parents only gave them ammunition to diminish my accomplishments. I looked at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely beautiful and completely secure. Julian was not just a supportive partner. He was my absolute anchor. He was 34 years old, with a quiet confidence that drew people to him effortlessly. My parents, Brenda and Calvin, deeply disapproved of him. They thought he was just a regular guy with a mediocre job because he wore plain sweaters and drove an older car. They did not know that his plain sweaters were custom-spun cashmere from Italy. They did not know that his older car was a meticulously restored vintage classic that cost more than their entire house. And they certainly did not know that Julian Davenport was the chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar private equity fund. Julian came from generations of wealth, but he despised flashy displays. He loved my independence and my sharp, analytical mind. I loved his humility and his steady, faithful heart. My phone began to vibrate violently on the small glass table next to the pedestal. The screen lit up with my mother's name. A familiar knot formed in my stomach. Brenda rarely called me during the workday, unless she needed something for Emily. I hesitated for a moment, but the seamstress smiled and nodded, indicating I could take the break. I picked up the phone and answered with a cheerful greeting, hoping for once that she was calling to ask about my wedding preparations. I did not even get the chance to ask how her day was going. "Roxanne, you need to cancel your wedding this weekend," Brenda said. Her voice was rushed and breathless with excitement. She did not ask how my fitting was going. She did not say hello. She just issued a command as if she were telling me to pick up milk from the grocery store. I stood frozen on the pedestal. I asked her to repeat herself, thinking I must have misunderstood the sheer absurdity of her words. "I said you need to call the courthouse and cancel whatever little party you and Julian are throwing." Brenda repeated, her tone sharp and intensely impatient. "Spencer just proposed to Emily. He gave her a massive diamond ring. It is absolutely stunning. We are hosting a massive engagement gala for them this Saturday at the Oakwood Country Club. You need to be there to help your sister with her dress and coordinate the caterers." The words hit me like physical blows to the chest. My own mother was demanding that I cancel my wedding day to attend an engagement party for my younger sister. Emily was 28 years old and had never held a job for more than 6 months. She had spent her entire life coasting on her looks and our parents' money. Spencer was her 30-year-old boyfriend who worked as an investment director. He was white and came from a family that loved to boast about their country club memberships and expensive vacations. My parents worshipped him blindly. They believed that having Spencer in the family elevated their social status within our community. They treated him like royalty, while treating my brilliant, hardworking fiancé like the hired help. I gripped the phone tightly. I told my mother that my wedding was this Saturday. I reminded her that Julian and I had been planning this date for months. I told her that she and Dad had promised to be there to witness me getting married. Brenda sighed loudly into the receiver. Oh, Roxanne, do not make this a bigger deal than it is. You and Julian are just signing some papers in a bleak government building. You can do that any day of the week. It is not like it is a real celebration. This is Emily's official entrance into high society. Spencer's parents are flying in from New York. They are incredibly important people in the financial sector. We cannot afford to look divided or unsupportive as a family. You know how hard Emily has worked to secure a man like Spencer. We need all hands on deck to make this party perfect. How hard Emily had worked. The phrase echoed in my mind and brought a bitter metallic taste to my mouth. I remembered working 60-hour weeks at a public accounting firm to pay off the massive credit card debt Emily had racked up in college. My parents had begged me to help her, claiming it would ruin her future credit score if I did not step in. I remembered eating instant noodles in my tiny apartment while my parents bought Emily a new luxury car for her 25th birthday because she felt sad about a breakup. I had built a career as a forensic accountant entirely on my own. I investigated complex corporate fraud and tracked down missing millions for high-profile corporate clients. I was highly respected in my field. I spent my days dismantling lies and finding the truth hidden in spreadsheets. Yet in my mother's eyes, my entire existence, my career, my relationship, my happiness was entirely secondary to Emily securing a wealthy husband. I tried to keep my voice steady. I told my mother that I would absolutely not cancel my wedding. I said that if she and Dad chose to attend an engagement party over their eldest daughter's wedding, that was their choice. But my date was set, and I was getting married. There was a scuffling sound on the other end of the line. Suddenly, my father, Calvin, was speaking. "Roxanne, listen to me right now," Calvin said. His voice carried the heavy, authoritative tone he always used when he wanted to force me into submission. "You are being completely selfish. This is exactly why you struggle to fit in with successful people. You never think about the family image. You only think about your own stubborn pride." I stared at my reflection in the large mirror. The woman looking back at me was wearing a gorgeous silk wedding gown, but she felt like the same helpless teenager who was never good enough to win her father's approval. "Dad, you are asking me to cancel my wedding day," I said quietly. "You are asking me to put my life on hold for a party." "It is not a real wedding, Roxanne," Calvin scoffed. "You are marrying a man who can barely afford to take you to a decent restaurant. You are wearing a cheap dress and standing in front of a judge. That is a legal transaction, not a wedding. Emily is marrying into the Vanguard Capital legacy. Spencer's family has real wealth. They have influence and power. If we skip this engagement party to attend your courthouse appointment, we will insult people who can actually open doors for us. We have to maintain our standing in this community, and Spencer is our ticket to doing exactly that. Your wedding is just a party. Do not be selfish." My father was entirely obsessed with respectability politics. He cared more about what Spencer's supposedly wealthy family thought of him than he cared about the heart of his own flesh and blood. He had always viewed Julian with undisguised disdain. He thought Julian lacked ambition because Julian did not brag about his investments or wear designer labels covered in giant flashy logos. My father believed that success had to be loud and obnoxious. He did not know that true wealth whispers, while fake wealth screams. He did not know that the man he was insulting could buy and sell Spencer's entire family legacy before breakfast. I felt a strange, cool sensation wash over my entire body. The anger that had been bubbling in my chest suddenly evaporated. The desperate childhood need to beg for their love completely disappeared. It was replaced by a cold and absolute clarity. My forensic accounting mind took over. I analyzed the situation exactly as I would analyze a fraudulent financial document. The numbers simply did not add up. The emotional investment I had poured into this family had yielded a deeply negative return for 31 years. They had continuously drained my resources, my empathy, and my patience. It was time to close the account permanently. I looked at the seamstress who was watching me with wide, sympathetic eyes. She had clearly heard the tone of the conversation even if she could not hear the exact cruel words my parents were shouting. I gave her a gentle, reassuring smile to show her I was perfectly fine. I was more than fine. I was finally awake. "Roxanne, are you listening to me?" Calvin demanded loudly through the speaker. "You will call the courthouse right now and cancel your appointment. You will come to the Oakwood Country Club at noon on Saturday to help set up the floral arrangements. Do not embarrass us in front of Spencer's family. We expect you to fall in line and do your part." I took a slow, deep breath. The silk of my dress felt incredibly soft and grounding against my skin. I thought about Julian. I thought about the beautiful private estate waiting for us with its manicured gardens and stunning architecture. I thought about the life we were building together, a life built on honesty and profound mutual respect. I realized I did not need Brenda and Calvin to validate my life. I did not need them to bless my marriage. They had made their choice. They had chosen an illusion of status over their own loyal daughter. They wanted a golden child and a wealthy white savior. They did not want me. "I get it," I said. My voice was calm, smooth, and entirely devoid of emotion. "Good," Calvin said, sounding immensely satisfied that he had won yet another argument. "We will see you on Saturday morning. Wear something presentable, but do not try to upstage your sister. This is her moment to shine." I did not say goodbye. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button to end the call. I opened my phone settings and navigated to my contacts list. I found my mother's number and pressed block. I found my father's number and pressed block. I found my sister Emily's number and pressed block. I watched their names disappear into the restricted list with a profound sense of relief. I set the phone back down on the glass table. The seamstress stood up slowly. She brushed a stray thread from the pristine skirt of my gown. "Are we still proceeding with the alterations, miss?" she asked softly, her voice filled with gentle concern. I looked at my reflection one more time. The woman in the mirror was no longer a victim waiting for scraps of affection. She was a brilliant professional stepping fully into her power. She was a woman who was about to marry a man who worshipped the ground she walked on. She was a woman who knew exactly what she was worth and refused to accept a discount ever again. "Yes," I said with a bright and genuinely radiant smile. "The dress is absolutely perfect. Please finish the alterations. My wedding is happening this Saturday exactly as planned." I knew that my family would eventually realize I was not at the country club. I knew they would try to call me to scream at me for ruining Emily's big day by not showing up to arrange her extravagant flowers. But I also knew that by the time they realized I was gone, I would already be married to Julian Davenport. I would be miles away, surrounded by a chosen family of friends who actually loved me. My biological parents wanted to worship Spencer and his supposed corporate empire. They wanted to push me aside to cater to people who looked down on them. I was going to let them have exactly what they asked for. But I knew the truth. As an investigator of fraud, I could smell a scam from a mile away. I knew that the house of cards Emily and Spencer were building was eventually going to collapse under the weight of its own lies. And when that inevitable destruction happened, I would not be there to clean up the mess or pay off the debts. I was finally walking away, leaving them to their desperate charade while I walked toward a beautifully authentic future. Saturday morning arrived with a soft golden light that seemed to bless the day. I was not at the Oakwood Country Club arranging cheap centerpieces for my sister. I was stepping out of a vintage silver car onto the crushed gravel driveway of an estate that looked like it had been pulled directly from a classic film. Julian had told me a few months ago that a close friend of his was allowing us to use the property for our ceremony. I had assumed it would be a nice house with a decent backyard. I had completely underestimated the scale of the place. Huge stone pillars flanked the entrance and manicured gardens stretched out as far as the eye could see. A string quartet was playing softly on a stone terrace overlooking a private lake. It was not a bleak government building. It was a fairy tale. As I walked down the aisle toward Julian, I felt a profound sense of peace. There were only a few people present. My best friend Sarah, who had flown in from Chicago, and Julian's mentor, an older gentleman who smiled warmly at me. The officiant spoke about love and partnership, But the most important words were the ones Julian and I had written for each other. When it was my turn to speak, my voice trembled slightly, but not from fear. I looked into Julian's steady brown eyes and spoke my truth. I told him how I had spent my entire life trying to buy love from my family that was never for sale. I talked about the years I spent working double shifts at a local diner while studying for my accounting degree. I told Julian how I used every single paycheck to secretly pay off the massive credit card debt my sister Emily had accumulated in college. My parents had told me that if I did not pay her debt, she would be sued, and it would bring terrible shame on our family name. I sacrificed my own peace of mind and my youth to protect her. I spent my nights poring over textbooks, learning how to track hidden funds and dismantle financial fraud, while my parents took out second mortgages to fund Emily's failed fashion boutiques and ridiculous business ventures. I told Julian how he was the first person to look at my scars and call them medals of honor. He never asked me to shrink myself to make him feel bigger. He never compared me to anyone else. Julian held both of my hands in his. His vows were simple, but they carried the weight of absolute certainty. He told me that he had spent his life surrounded by people who wore masks, but I was the most authentic woman he had ever met. He promised to protect my peace and to stand as a shield between me and anyone who tried to diminish my light. He slipped a simple, elegant platinum band onto my finger, and I did the same for him. When he kissed me, the silence of the estate wrapped around us like a protective blanket. There was no screaming mother, no demanding father, no spoiled sister. There was only us. After the ceremony, we sat down for a private candlelit dinner on the terrace. The catering staff had prepared a phenomenal 5-course meal. We drank sparkling cider and talked about our future. We talked about buying a house with a large garden where we could rescue dogs and host dinner parties for our actual friends. The evening air was cool and crisp. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. I felt so completely removed from the toxic drama of my biological family that they might as well have existed on another planet. I did not care that Emily was probably at the country club right now throwing a tantrum because her older sister was not there to steam her dress. I did not care that my father was probably complaining to his golf buddies about my supposed selfishness. I was free. We had just finished our main course when the profound silence of the evening was broken by a persistent buzzing sound. Julian's phone was sitting face down on the edge of the table. It vibrated violently against the wood. Then it stopped. A few seconds later, it started buzzing again. It vibrated so hard it almost moved off the edge of the table. I watched it with a sinking feeling in my chest. I knew exactly who it was. I assumed my parents had finally realized I was not going to show up to the engagement party. I pictured my mother red-faced and furious, dialing my number, finding out she was blocked, and immediately targeting Julian's phone to scream at him instead. I imagined my father grabbing the phone to threaten us, telling us we were dead to the family. I looked at Julian and apologized. I told him to just turn the phone off so we could enjoy the rest of our evening. I felt a brief flash of guilt that their toxicity was attempting to infect our perfect wedding night. But Julian did not look annoyed. He did not look stressed or angry. He reached over and picked up the phone. He looked at the screen for a long moment. A slow, calm smile spread across his handsome face. He did not press the button to answer or decline the call. He simply let it ring in his hand. He looked up at me, his dark eyes gleaming with a quiet, intense amusement. He gently placed the phone back down on the table and picked up his crystal wine glass. He swirled the deep red liquid, watching it coat the inside of the glass. "Are you going to answer that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I was suddenly intensely curious about the expression on his face. Julian took a slow sip of his wine before setting the glass down. He rested his elbows on the table and leaned forward. He told me I had exactly 47 missed calls. I stared at him in shock. 47 missed calls. That was excessive even for my mother's dramatic tantrums. I asked him if someone was hurt or if there was a real emergency. Julian chuckled, a deep, rich sound that echoed on the quiet terrace. "No, my love, there is no emergency," he said softly. "Spencer just posted his engagement photos on social media. I frowned, trying to understand what Spencer's engagement photos had to do with 47 frantic phone calls to my husband. Julian reached across the table and took my hand. His thumb gently stroked my new wedding band. He explained that Spencer's father is a man named Richard, who has spent his entire life trying to climb the corporate ladder in the financial sector. Richard likes to pretend he is part of the elite inner circle, but he is really just a mid-level player desperately trying to look important. Julian smiled again, a predator's smile masked by perfect manners. It turns out Richard follows the corporate board directory very closely, Julian murmured. He saw the photos Spencer posted online. He saw the group shots that included us from that dinner we attended a few months ago. Richard recognized my face immediately. He knows exactly who sits on the board of directors for the parent company that owns Vanguard Capital. I sat frozen processing his words. I asked Julian what he meant. Julian leaned back in his chair. He told me that my parents and Spencer's family had just searched his name online. He said they just found out that the man they have been insulting for the past year, the man my father called a low-level nobody, is actually the chief executive officer of Davenport Holdings. They just realized that I am the sole heir to a family trust worth over $3 billion. They just realized that I essentially own the company Spencer works for. I stared at my husband. The cool evening breeze suddenly felt entirely still. I asked him to repeat himself. I told him I knew he was successful, but I thought he ran a small investment firm. I thought the estate we were sitting in belonged to a wealthy friend. Julian looked around the sprawling manicured lawns and the grand stone architecture of the mansion behind us. He told me that he did not want to lie to me, but he needed to be sure I loved him for who he was, not for what he possessed. He said he had spent his 20s being targeted by people who only wanted access to his family wealth. When he met me, he saw a brilliant, independent woman who investigated financial fraud for a living. He saw a woman who paid her own way and refused to be bought. He wanted to give me the world, but he wanted to wait until my ring was on his finger to hand me the keys. This estate does belong to a friend, he said, his eyes dancing with amusement. It belongs to my holding company. I am the friend. I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding. A laugh bubbled up from my chest, starting soft, and then growing into a bright, clear sound that filled the night air. I imagined the scene at the country club. I imagined Spencer bragging to his friends about his new engagement ring. I imagined my father puffing out his chest, talking about how his future son-in-law was a high society investment director. And then I imagined Spencer's father pulling out his smartphone, typing the name Julian Davenport into the search bar, and watching the blood drain from his face as the search results loaded. I imagined my mother looking over his shoulder, seeing the articles from Financial Times, detailing Julian's massive acquisitions and philanthropic foundations. I imagined the exact moment my parents realized they had just demanded I cancel my wedding to a billionaire so I could arrange cheap flowers for a man who worked for my husband. The phone on the table began to buzz again. Call number 48. Julian did not even look at it. He asked me if I wanted him to turn it off now. I looked at the vibrating piece of metal. For 31 years, a call from my parents meant anxiety, fear, and a desperate need to please them. Now it was just a pathetic, desperate noise from people who had realized they had backed the wrong horse. I told Julian to leave it on. I wanted to watch it ring. I wanted to enjoy the visual representation of their absolute panic. We sat there under the stars eating wedding cake and listening to the desperate buzzing of a family that had just realized the magnitude of their catastrophic mistake. 3 hours passed since we let the phone ring on the terrace. We moved into the grand living room of the estate to enjoy the warmth of the massive stone fireplace. Julian poured us each a cup of tea. We were enjoying the quiet intimacy of our first night as a married couple when the wall-mounted intercom chimed a soft electronic tone. Julian walked over and pressed a button on the sleek console. The voice of the estate security chief came through the speaker. He apologized for the late interruption and reported that a vehicle was blocking the main gate. The occupants were aggressively demanding entry and claiming to be the parents of the bride. Julian looked at me and pressed another button to patch the main gate audio through to the living room speakers. The sudden chaotic noise of my mother filled the elegant room. Brenda was screaming into the call box. Her voice was shrill and desperate. She was yelling my name over and over again. She demanded that the security guards open the gate immediately because she was the mother of the bride and she had a right to see her favorite daughter. Favorite daughter. The words hung in the air like a foul odor. I sat on the plush sofa and stared at the intercom speaker. For my entire life, Emily had been the golden child. I was the burden. I was the financial safety net they used whenever Emily maxed out her credit cards. Now, because they had searched my husband on the internet and realized he controlled billions of dollars, I was suddenly the favorite daughter. My father, Calvin, pushed his way to the call box. His voice boomed through the speakers. He tried to use his commanding tone, the one he used to bully people at church meetings and community events. He told the guards that he was Calvin, and he demanded to speak to Julian Davenport right this instant. He yelled that this was all a huge misunderstanding and that family needed to stick together. He shouted that they had driven all the way out here to properly celebrate the marriage of two incredibly important families. I listened to their frantic voices echoing off the high ceilings of Julian's estate. My forensic accounting mind dissected their panic. They were not here to celebrate my marriage. They were here because they realized they had completely humiliated themselves in front of a man who could buy their entire social circle with his pocket change. They had insulted Julian and treated him like a peasant. They had demanded I cancel my wedding to cater to Spencer, who worked for a company Julian owned. They were terrified that Julian would use his immense power to crush them. They were desperately trying to do damage control before their fake high society reputation was destroyed. The security chief asked Julian if he should call the local police to remove the trespassers. Julian looked at me, waiting for my decision. He gave me complete control over the situation. I stood up and walked over to the wall-mounted intercom. I listened to my mother begging me to answer. She wailed that she brought me a wedding gift and that she just wanted to hug her precious girl. Her sudden display of affection made my stomach turn. I reached behind the sleek electronic console. I found the main power cable connecting the unit to the wall. I did not press the button to speak. I did not tell them to leave. I simply gripped the cord and calmly pulled it from the socket. The screaming stopped instantly. The living room was plunged back into peaceful silence. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. I turned back to Julian and smiled. I told him I was ready to go to sleep. We walked up the grand staircase together, leaving my parents screaming at a steel gate in the middle of nowhere while we rested peacefully in the comfort of absolute security. A week passed since our beautiful wedding. Julian and I spent the days enjoying a quiet, luxurious honeymoon at the estate, completely disconnected from the outside world. We ignored our phones and focused entirely on building the foundation of our marriage. When we finally returned to our primary residence in the city, the reality of the outside world was waiting for us in a stack of mail. I sorted through the letters and envelopes on the kitchen island. Hidden between utility bills and financial reports was a massive envelope made of heavy textured paper. The return address was printed in shiny gold foil. I knew exactly what it was before I even opened it. It was an invitation to Emily and Spencer's official engagement gala. I slid my finger under the seal and pulled out the card. It was a ridiculously flashy piece of cardstock covered in embossed lettering and excessive glitter. It announced that Brenda and Calvin formally requested the honor of my presence to celebrate the union of Emily and Spencer at the most exclusive country club in the county. As an auditor, I read between the lines of the expensive paper. I knew my parents' financial situation perfectly well. I knew that booking the main ballroom at that specific country club cost more than their combined annual income. I knew they must have taken out a second mortgage or maxed out dangerous credit lines just to afford the deposit. They were bleeding themselves dry to impress Spencer and his supposedly wealthy white family. The invitation included a handwritten note from my mother on the back. She wrote that they missed me terribly and begged Julian and me to attend as their guests of honor. She underlined the word honor twice. The desperation was palpable. I looked at the glittering card and felt absolutely nothing. I had no intention of walking into a room full of fake smiles and toxic respectability politics. I planned to drop the heavy envelope directly into the trash can and continue living my peaceful life. I did not need to confront them. I had already won by simply walking away. Before I could drop the invitation into the garbage, my personal cell phone rang. I looked at the screen. It was not a blocked number from my parents. It was my grandmother, Beatrice. Grandma Beatrice was 80 years old and possessed a mind sharper than a steel trap. She was my father's mother, but she shared none of his superficial obsession with social status. She was a retired school teacher who had marched for civil rights and built her life on genuine hard work. She was the only person in my biological family who had ever protected me. When my parents ignored my academic awards to praise Emily for winning a beauty pageant, Grandma Beatrice was the one who took me out for ice cream and told me my brain would take me further than any crown. When my parents refused to help me pay for college, she secretly slipped me cash from her pension to help me buy my accounting textbooks. She saw right through Brenda and Calvin, and she never hesitated to call out their foolishness. I answered the phone with a genuine smile. Grandma Beatrice did not waste time with small talk. She immediately asked if I had received the ridiculous gold-plated invitation to Emily's circus of an engagement party. I laughed and told her I was holding it over the trash can right now. She chuckled a dry knowing sound. She told me to wait before I threw it away. She said she had just received her own invitation, and she had absolutely no desire to sit in a room full of stuck-up snobs by herself. Then she paused. Her voice grew serious and steady. She told me that Brenda and Calvin had been running around the neighborhood acting completely insane all week. She said they were whispering behind closed doors and pacing the floors like trapped animals. Grandma Beatrice knew something had happened on Saturday, but she did not know exactly what. She said she could smell the fear radiating off my parents, and she knew they were planning some kind of manipulative trap for the engagement party. Then my grandmother made a request I could not ignore. She asked me for a ride to the gala. She said her knees were aching and she did not want to take a taxi to the country club. But more importantly, she said she wanted to see me. She said she wanted to meet the man I had married. She wanted to look Julian in the eye and make sure he was treating her smartest granddaughter with the absolute respect she deserved. She told me she wanted me to walk into that country club with my head held high and show those hypocrites exactly what a successful independent black woman looked like. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone tightly. I had sworn I would never let my parents humiliate me in a public setting again. I had sworn I was done with their games. But I could not say no to the woman who had spent decades quietly supporting my dreams when everyone else tried to crush them. I owed Grandma Beatrice my presence. She wanted to see me shine, and I was determined to give her that satisfaction. I told her I would pick her up on Saturday evening. I promised her Julian would be driving the car and that we would make a grand entrance together. Grandma Beatrice let out a triumphant laugh and told me to wear my most expensive dress. She hung up, leaving me staring at the gold foil invitation still resting on the counter. Julian walked into the kitchen and saw the expression on my face. He wrapped his arms around my waist and asked what my grandmother had said. I leaned back against his chest and told him that our peaceful week was officially over. I explained that Grandma Beatrice wanted an escort to Emily's engagement party, and I could not refuse her. I told Julian he did not have to come if he did not want to deal with the toxic atmosphere of my family's social climbing event. Julian rested his chin on my shoulder and looked at the gaudy invitation. He did not look worried or annoyed. He looked incredibly calm. He told me that wherever I went, he went. He said he had married me to be my partner in all things, including facing down the people who had tried to break my spirit. He gently took the invitation from my hand and tossed it onto the kitchen island. He said we would go to the country club to honor my grandmother and to watch my parents try to navigate the massive hole they had dug for themselves. I felt a surge of profound gratitude for the man holding me. We spent the rest of the week preparing for the gala. I did not buy a new dress to impress them. I simply pulled a perfectly tailored emerald green sheath dress from my closet. It was elegant, understated, and professional. Julian prepared a classic dark suit without any flashy labels. We did not need to wear our wealth on our sleeves to prove our worth. We knew exactly who we were, and we knew exactly what kind of financial firepower Julian commanded quietly from the shadows. Saturday evening arrived with a crisp breeze. Julian pulled his immaculate vintage car up to the front of Grandma Beatrice's modest brick house. When she walked out the front door, leaning slightly on her wooden cane, her eyes lit up at the sight of Julian opening the door for her. She looked him up and down, nodding in silent approval at his impeccable manners and quiet confidence. She climbed into the back seat and patted my shoulder, leaning forward to tell me that tonight was going to be a very interesting evening. As Julian drove us toward the sprawling manicured grounds of the Oakwood Country Club, I felt my forensic accounting mind slip into high gear. I was no longer the wounded daughter seeking approval from parents who refused to give it. I was a professional investigator, walking into a room full of suspects who were drowning in debt and desperate to maintain their fake high society illusions. I knew Spencer was a fraud. I knew my parents were financially drowning. And I knew that tonight the entire fragile house of cards they had built was going to be tested. We pulled through the wrought iron gates of the country club. The valet rushed forward to open our doors. The distant sound of a string quartet and the clinking of champagne glasses drifted out from the grand ballroom. I took a deep breath of the cool evening air. I linked my arm through Julian's right side and offered my left arm to support my grandmother. We walked toward the heavy oak doors of the country club, completely prepared to face the people who had tried to discard us, setting the stage for a confrontation they would never forget. We stepped through the heavy oak doors of the Oakwood Country Club, and the immediate wall of sound hit us. The grand ballroom was dripping in excessive floral arrangements that looked like they cost a small fortune. Crystal chandeliers cast a harsh light over the room full of people desperate to prove their worth. I held my head high with my grandmother on my left and my husband on my right. Before we could even reach the welcome table, a blur of emerald green silk came rushing toward us. It was my mother, Brenda. Usually when I disobeyed her, she would greet me with a scowl and a harsh whisper about how I was ruining her reputation. Today her face was stretched into a massive, unnatural smile. She did not even look at me. She practically shoved her shoulder past my arm, completely ignoring my presence, and made a direct line for Julian. She reached out and grabbed both of Julian's hands, squeezing them tightly. She started speaking in a loud, overly sweet voice that I had never heard her use before. She called him her wonderful son-in-law and said she was so incredibly thrilled that he could make it to the party. She complimented his suit, saying she could tell it was custom-tailored, and she asked if he had a pleasant drive over. She did not mention my canceled wedding. She did not mention the 47 missed calls. She just stared up at him with wide, desperate eyes, practically begging for his validation. Julian looked down at her hands, gripping his. He did not pull away, but his posture remained perfectly rigid and formal. He offered a polite, tight smile and thanked her for the invitation. He said he would not have missed the opportunity to escort his beautiful wife and her grandmother to such an interesting family gathering. He emphasized the word interesting, and I saw my mother swallow hard. Grandma Beatrice leaned heavily on her cane and let out a loud, dry laugh. She looked right at my mother and asked, "Since when did Brenda start greeting the hired help with such enthusiasm?" She reminded my mother that just last month she had called Julian a broke nobody who was holding her daughter back. My mother turned pale and her eyes darted nervously around the foyer to see if anyone had heard the comment. She stammered and told Beatrice that was just a silly misunderstanding and that she had always known Julian was a man of great substance. I watched this pathetic display with clinical detachment. My mother was so consumed by her greed and her panic that she abandoned every ounce of her dignity in front of the country club staff. I stepped forward and gently untangled my mother's hands from my husband. I told her we needed to go inside and find our seats so my grandmother could rest her legs. My mother immediately nodded and started ushering us into the main ballroom, hovering around Julian like an anxious servant. The ballroom was a sea of forced laughter and aggressive networking. My father, Calvin, was standing near the center of the room, surrounded by a group of loud, obnoxious people. I recognized them immediately as Spencer's family. Spencer's father was a tall, heavy-set white man with a red face and a booming voice. He was wearing a tuxedo that was slightly too tight across the middle, and he was laughing loudly at his own jokes. Spencer's mother stood next to him wearing a bright pink designer gown covered in sequins. As a forensic accountant, I had a habit of noticing the small details that people tried to hide. I looked closely at the pink gown and recognized it as a dress from 3 seasons ago. I noticed the way Spencer's father kept checking his watch, which was a cheap imitation of a high-end brand. I saw the desperate tension in their body language. They were performing wealth, but they did not actually possess it. They were loud and arrogant because they were trying to drown out the reality of their own financial ruin. My father was standing next to Spencer's, Dad nodding vigorously at everything the man said. Calvin looked like a subordinate trying to win favor from a tyrannical boss. He was completely abandoning his own self-respect just to be seen in the presence of these supposedly elite people. When my father saw Julian and me walking toward the table, his expression froze. He quickly excused himself from Spencer's parents and jogged over to intercept us before we could reach the main group. Calvin did not yell at me for ignoring his orders. He did not reprimand me for blocking his number. He reached out and awkwardly clapped Julian on the shoulder. He called him a great man and said he was honored to have him in the family. He spoke in a hushed, urgent tone, asking Julian if they could perhaps schedule a private golf game next week to discuss some exciting investment opportunities. Julian looked at the hand on his shoulder and then looked my father dead in the eye. He calmly stated that his schedule was completely booked for the foreseeable future, and he only did business with people who demonstrated basic respect for his wife. My father withdrew his hand quickly, his face flushing with deep embarrassment. He opened his mouth to make another excuse, but Grandma Beatrice interrupted him. She told her son to stop groveling because he was embarrassing himself and making her sick. We moved to our assigned table near the back of the room. It was clear we had originally been seated in the worst spot possible to keep Julian out of sight. But now my mother was frantically trying to flag down the event coordinator to move our table to the front of the room near the stage. Julian gently told the coordinator to leave the table exactly where it was. He said we preferred the view from the back. It gave us a perfect vantage point to observe the entire room. I sat next to Julian and watched my parents scramble. They were caught in a miserable balancing act. On one side of the room, they were desperate to impress Spencer's family, who they still believed held the keys to white high society. On the other side of the room, they were terrified of offending Julian, who they now knew held actual billions in real-world power. They were running back and forth between the two families, sweating profusely under the chandeliers. Spencer's parents were completely oblivious to the shifting power dynamics. They continued to act like they owned the country club, loudly demanding faster service from the waitstaff and complaining about the quality of the appetizers. Spencer's mother made a highly inappropriate comment to a server, complaining about the lack of good help these days. My parents stood there and smiled, tolerating the blatant disrespect simply because they thought these people were wealthy. I leaned my head close to Julian and told him that Spencer's family was drowning in debt. I explained that I had run a preliminary background check on their names out of professional curiosity. They had multiple liens against their property and were living entirely on credit, hoping Spencer's promotion would save them from complete bankruptcy. They were parasites feeding on the illusion of prestige, and my parents were eagerly offering themselves up as the host. Julian rested his hand on my knee under the table. He said it was fascinating to watch people construct their own prisons. He noted that my parents were so blinded by their internalized racism and their desperate need for external validation that they could not see the actual value standing right in front of them. They worshipped a broke, arrogant man simply because of his background, while they actively discarded their own brilliant daughter. The music swelled as Emily and Spencer finally made their grand entrance into the ballroom. Emily was wearing a white engagement dress that looked more like a wedding gown. She had a massive fake smile plastered across her face, waving to the crowd like a minor celebrity. Spencer walked beside her, looking smug and entirely too pleased with himself. They stopped in the center of the dance floor for photos, and my parents rushed forward to stand beside them, posing for the cameras with wide, desperate grins. I sat quietly in the back of the room, drinking my water and watching the tragic comedy unfold. I felt a deep sense of pity for my parents. They had traded their dignity for a front-row seat on a sinking ship. I knew the truth about Spencer and his fake empire, and I knew that the evening was only going to get more interesting. I turned to Grandma Beatrice, who was watching the spectacle with a look of pure disgust. She leaned over and told me that she could not wait for the moment the truth finally came out and shattered their pathetic illusion into a million pieces. The grand ballroom felt suffocating under the weight of so much fake joy and desperate networking. So I excused myself from the table, leaving Julian in deep conversation with Grandma Beatrice. I navigated my way through the sea of overpriced gowns and rented tuxedos, keeping my gaze focused straight ahead. The heavy oak doors of the ladies' powder room offered a temporary sanctuary from the loud music and the clinking of champagne glasses. The bathroom was overly ornate, with pink marble countertops and gold-plated faucets that looked like they were trying entirely too hard to be elegant. I walked over to the sink and turned on the cold water, letting it run over my wrists to ground myself. Looking into the gilded mirror, I took a slow, deep breath, admiring the simple emerald green dress that fit me perfectly. There was no anxiety in my chest anymore, just a cool, analytical calm. The heavy wooden door suddenly swung open, hitting the wall stopper with a loud thud that echoed against the marble tile. I did not flinch. I simply looked through the mirror to see the reflection of my younger sister marching into the room. Emily was wearing a white designer engagement dress that looked more suited for a red carpet event than a country club dinner. Her hair was perfectly styled and her makeup was flawless, but her eyes were wild with frantic, furious energy. She marched straight up to the sinks, invading my personal space, and stood glaring at me through the mirror. She did not say hello. She did not apologize for hijacking my wedding date. She did not ask how my small private ceremony had gone earlier that morning. "You are completely unbelievable," she hissed, her voice vibrating with pure rage. "You sit there at the back table acting like you are better than everyone else while keeping the biggest secret of the century from your own family. How could you do this to me, Roxanne? How could you let me look like a fool out there?" I calmly turned off the faucet and reached for a decorative hand towel. I dried my hands with slow, deliberate motions. I asked her what exactly I had done to make her look like a fool. "Do not play dumb with me," she snapped, crossing her arms over her chest. "You knew Julian was a billionaire. You knew he owned Davenport Holdings, and you never said a single word. You let Mom and Dad treat him like some regular guy working a standard 9-to-5 job. You let Spencer's parents talk down to him. You deliberately set us up to look like idiots. You knew this was my special night and you brought him here to steal my spotlight. You always have to ruin everything for me." I threw the damp towel into the brass wastebasket. I turned to face my sister directly. I told her that I did not bring Julian to steal her spotlight. I brought him because Grandma Beatrice asked for a ride. I reminded her that just a few days ago, she and our parents had demanded I cancel my own wedding to come arrange her centerpieces. I pointed out that it was not my fault they chose to judge Julian based on his lack of flashy logos. They made their own assumptions, and now they had to live with the embarrassment of their own shallow behavior. Emily let out a harsh, bitter laugh. She paced back and forth across the pink marble floor, her high heels clicking loudly. "You are so selfish, Roxanne. You have always been selfish. You sit on a mountain of wealth while your own family struggles to put together a decent party to secure my future. Do you have any idea how much pressure I am under right now? Spencer's family expects a certain lifestyle. They expect luxury and connections and status. Mom and Dad are doing everything they can to help me, but it is barely enough to keep up appearances. And all this time you had a billionaire husband in your back pocket, and you kept him hidden out of pure spite." The entitlement radiating from her was staggering. She genuinely believed that my husband's wealth belonged to the family. She believed that my private life existed solely to fund her social climbing ambitions. My forensic accounting mind began to dissect her panic. She was not angry that I had kept a secret. She was angry that she had not been able to exploit that secret for her own financial gain. She stopped pacing and stopped right in front of me. She looked me up and down, her eyes narrowing as she calculated her next move. She dropped the aggressive tone and suddenly shifted into a manipulative, pleading voice. She reached out and tried to grab my hands, but I smoothly stepped back. "Look," she said, softening her features into the practiced pout that had always worked on our parents. "We can fix this. We can turn this whole night around. You just need to do one small thing for me. You need to go out there and make Julian write me a check." I stared at her, my face completely blank. I asked her why on earth my husband would write her a check. "As an apology gift," she said quickly, as if this was the most logical request in the world. "As compensation for keeping secrets and missing my actual engagement announcement last week. Mom and Dad had to take out another massive loan just to pay the deposit for this ballroom. Spencer's parents expect us to pay for the wedding entirely on our own, and the venues we are looking at are incredibly expensive. If Julian writes me a check for $200,000, it will cover the rest of this party and pay for the wedding of my dreams. He is a billionaire, Roxanne. $200,000 is literally pocket change to him. It is nothing, but it would change my life." I stood in the powder room listening to the muffled sounds of the string quartet playing out in the hallway. I looked at my sister, the golden child who had never worked a hard day in her life, demanding a fortune as an apology for a perceived slight. I thought about the nights I had stayed awake until 3 in the morning, auditing spreadsheets to pay off the credit card debts she had hidden from our parents. I thought about the way she had mocked my career, calling me a boring number cruncher, while she chased wealthy men at downtown bars. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or throw insults. I used the most terrifying weapon I possessed, which was the absolute, unvarnished truth. I told Emily that she was absolutely right about one thing. $200,000 was pocket change to Julian. But I told her that she was completely out of her mind if she thought I would ever let my husband give her a single dime. Emily gasped, her face flushing bright red. "How can you be so cruel?" she hissed. "You have billions. You do not even need it. You are just trying to sabotage my relationship with Spencer because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of me because Mom and Dad loved me more." I smiled a cold, clinical smile that made her take a step back. I told her I was not jealous of a woman who was drowning in a desperate illusion. I took a step forward, closing the distance between us. I looked closely at the neckline of her extravagant white dress. I told her to stop talking about high society and wealth because we both knew the truth. I raised my hand and pointed a single finger at the collar of her dress. I told her to fix her collar because the original store price tag was currently scratching the back of her neck. I told her I could see the plastic string tucked hastily under the white silk. I knew she had bought the dress on a high-interest store credit card yesterday, and she was planning to return it tomorrow morning before the 24-hour return policy expired. Emily's hand flew to the back of her neck, her eyes widening in pure horror. Her fingers fumbled against the hidden tag. I did not stop there. The forensic accountant in me tore the rest of her facade to shreds. I listed the exact financial realities of her supposedly glamorous life. I told her I knew she was currently 3 months behind on her luxury car lease because the collection agency had accidentally called my old phone number looking for her. I told her I knew that the diamond ring Spencer gave her had a massive visible inclusion and was financed on a 5-year payment plan that he could barely afford. I told her I knew that our parents had taken out a second mortgage on their house just to rent this ballroom for one night. I spoke slowly, letting every single financial fact land like a heavy blow. I told her that her entire relationship with Spencer was a scam built on mutually assured deception. Spencer's family thought my parents had money, and my parents thought Spencer's family had money. They were two broke, desperate families playing a pathetic game of chicken, hoping the other side would pay the bills before the truth came out. Emily was trembling now. Her perfect makeup was beginning to crack under the weight of her panic. She backed away from me, her hands gripping the edges of the pink marble sink behind her. She stammered, trying to form a coherent sentence, but the facts had completely dismantled her false reality. She accused me of spying on her and hacking her accounts. I laughed softly. I told her I did not need to hack anything. Desperate people leave a trail of obvious clues that anyone with basic observational skills can read. I told her that she and Spencer were parasites trying to feed off an illusion of prestige, and now she was trying to attach herself to my husband's bank account to save herself from the inevitable collapse. "You owe me!" she cried out, her voice breaking into a desperate sob. "You are my sister. You are supposed to help me. Mom said you would eventually help pay for the wedding if we pressured you enough." I shook my head slowly. I told her the days of me serving as the family safety net were permanently over. I reminded her of the exact date 5 years ago when I begged our parents for help with my final semester of college tuition. They told me they had no money to spare. The very next day, they bought her a brand new car because she was feeling depressed about a minor breakup. I told her that was the exact moment I realized I had no family. I only had blood relatives who viewed me as a utility. I took another step toward the door. I told Emily that she was going to walk back out into that ballroom and she was going to smile and dance with her fraudulent fiancé. I told her she was going to enjoy the party that our parents had sacrificed their home to pay for. And I told her she was going to do it, knowing that she would not be getting a single penny from me or my husband to save her from the massive debt awaiting her tomorrow morning. She stared at me, tears welling up in her eyes and spilling over her dark eyelashes, leaving black streaks down her face. She looked small and pathetic, standing there in a dress she could not afford, begging for money to impress people who did not care about her. She asked me how I could be so cold. She asked me if I felt any guilt at all for watching my own family drown. I placed my hand on the heavy brass handle of the bathroom door. I looked back at her one last time. I told her that I was not cold. I was simply matching the exact energy they had given me for my entire life. I told her that when you treat people like they do not matter, you cannot be surprised when they eventually stop caring about you. I pulled the door open, the loud music from the ballroom immediately flooding back into the space. I told Emily to fix her makeup and tuck her price tag back in because it was time to put on a show for her future in-laws. I stepped out of the powder room and let the heavy wooden door swing shut behind me, leaving her completely alone in front of the mirrors to face the reality of her own shallow existence. I walked back to our table in the dim corner of the ballroom, feeling a deep sense of absolute clarity after leaving Emily to drown in her own pathetic delusions in the powder room. The air inside the main hall was thick with the smell of heavy floral perfumes and roasted meat that my parents had undoubtedly financed with a high-interest loan. Julian was sitting exactly where I had left him, pouring a fresh cup of tea for Grandma Beatrice. They were laughing quietly at a private joke. Their heads leaned close together in a bubble of genuine warmth that stood in stark contrast to the freezing fake atmosphere of the country club. I sat down, and Julian immediately shifted his complete attention to me. His dark eyes scanned my face with quiet intensity, checking for any signs of emotional distress after my forced encounter with my sister. I simply smiled at him and took a slow sip of my ice water, letting him know without a single word that the situation had been handled with absolute forensic precision. The live band started playing a loud, upbeat song, and the polished wooden dance floor quickly filled with people trying desperately to look like they belonged in this exclusive high society setting. I watched my parents spinning around the floor with wide, fake smiles plastered across their faces, pretending that their bank accounts were not currently bleeding dry to fund this elaborate charade. Suddenly, I noticed a commotion near the open bar. Spencer was breaking away from a group of loud men in rented tuxedos. He was holding a short crystal glass filled with amber liquid, and his steps were noticeably unsteady. He had already consumed far too much alcohol for an engagement party, but his arrogance made him completely blind to his own sloppy behavior. His face was flushed a bright, patchy red, and his tie was slightly crooked. He began making his way across the crowded room, heading directly toward our isolated table in the back. I knew exactly what he was doing, and my analytical mind immediately predicted his entire psychological strategy. In his own small mind, he was the absolute king of this castle tonight. He had secured the golden child of a black family that worshipped the ground he walked on, and he needed to assert his dominance over the only people in the room who were refusing to bow down to him. My father Calvin saw Spencer moving toward our table and immediately broke away from his dance with my mother. Calvin jogged across the room to trail behind his future son-in-law like an anxious, desperate bodyguard. Calvin looked absolutely terrified that Julian might say something to offend the white man he viewed as our family's ultimate savior. Spencer reached our table and slammed his empty hand down on the crisp white linen tablecloth, causing the expensive silver flatware to rattle loudly. He stood over Julian, puffing out his chest, trying to look physically imposing and important. Julian did not stand up to greet him. He did not even flinch at the loud noise. My husband simply looked up at Spencer with the calm, detached expression of a brilliant scientist observing a particularly loud and annoying insect. Spencer let out a booming, obnoxious laugh that smelled heavily of cheap whiskey and bad decisions. He told Julian that it was a real crying shame we were hiding all the way in the back of the room like outcasts. He said we were missing all the real corporate networking happening near the stage with his important family members. He slurred his words slightly as he leaned heavily against the back of an empty dining chair. He loudly announced to our table that he had just secured a massive verbal commitment from a local real estate developer who wanted to invest millions with Vanguard Capital. I watched Spencer carefully cataloging every single lie that fell out of his mouth. My background as a forensic accountant allowed me to see right through his sloppy, drunken performance. Real investment directors at top-tier financial firms do not brag about unsecured verbal commitments at their own engagement parties while heavily intoxicated. They operate with strict discretion and intense professional paranoia. Spencer was acting like a desperate used car salesman trying to hit a monthly quota before his boss fired him. He wanted to make sure Julian knew exactly how important and powerful he supposedly was. Calvin finally arrived at the table completely out of breath and immediately started nodding along with every word Spencer said. My father proudly told Grandma Beatrice that Spencer was about to be named the National Director of Investments for Vanguard Capital very soon. Calvin proclaimed that Spencer was a true titan of modern industry, and that our family was incredibly blessed and highly favored to welcome such a brilliant financial mind into our fold. Spencer took a large, aggressive gulp from his glass and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked down at Julian's pristine, custom-tailored suit, and then looked over at my simple, elegant green dress. A nasty, condescending smirk spread across his red, sweaty face. He asked Julian what exactly he did for a living, since my parents had only vaguely mentioned something about him working a boring desk job in finance. Julian answered politely and softly, stating that he worked in private equity and corporate acquisitions. Spencer's smirk widened into a full disrespectful grin. He took a deliberate step closer, completely invading Julian's personal space. He said private equity was a really tough racket, especially for people who did not have the right social connections or the proper educational pedigree. Then the casual racism escalated into blatant physical disrespect. Spencer leaned down and deliberately patted Julian on the shoulder with a heavy, patronizing hand. It was a calculated physical microaggression designed to make Julian feel small, inadequate, and subordinate in a room full of wealthy white guests. Spencer said he knew exactly how hard it was for minorities to break into the upper echelons of the financial sector. He used the phrase "you guys" with a sickening familiarity that made my blood run completely cold. He told Julian that he heard Vanguard Capital had just laid off a massive group of low-level analysts earlier this week due to budget cuts. He said the corporate restructuring was absolutely brutal and that it was always the diverse hires who got cut first because they simply could not keep up with the rigorous intellectual demands of real high finance. He patted Julian's shoulder again with that same heavy, arrogant hand. Spencer looked down his nose at my billionaire husband and told him, "It is tough for you guys to climb the corporate ladder, but keep grinding, man. Maybe one day you will get a lucky break." The casual racism and the staggering corporate arrogance hung in the air above our table like toxic smoke. My father stood there and actually nodded in agreement, completely validating Spencer's racist garbage because he was too much of a coward to defend his own black son-in-law. Calvin looked at Julian with a severe warning glare, silently demanding that Julian accept the insult. swallow his pride, and thank Spencer for his condescending career advice. Grandma Beatrice tightened her grip on her wooden cane. I saw her knuckles turn completely white, and I knew she was mere seconds away from standing up and striking Spencer across the knees for disrespecting our table. I gently placed my hand over hers and gave it a soft squeeze to keep her seated. I did not want to interrupt the absolute masterpiece of a response that I knew my husband was about to deliver. Julian did not aggressively brush Spencer's hand off his shoulder. He did not raise his voice or show a single ounce of anger, ego, or intimidation. He simply picked up his heavy glass of bourbon and took a slow, deliberate sip. The ice clinked softly against the crystal, cutting through the tense silence of our table. He looked up at Spencer, his dark eyes entirely devoid of emotion, and offering a polite, chilling smile that did not reach his eyes. Julian simply said, "Oh, I am well aware of the restructuring at Vanguard." He spoke the words with such quiet, absolute authority that Spencer actually blinked in genuine confusion. Julian continued, his voice smooth and perfectly controlled, stating that the financial sector requires ruthless efficiency, and that holding companies must always trim the dead weight and eliminate fraudulent employees who fail to provide actual value to the firm. He looked Spencer directly in the eyes, pinning him to the spot, and said, "Sometimes the loudest people in the room are the ones closest to the chopping block." Spencer did not fully grasp the immense weight of Julian's words because his brain was clouded by cheap alcohol and his own inflated delusions of grandeur. He completely missed the lethal precision hidden inside my husband's polite corporate response. Spencer just laughed again, assuming Julian was agreeing with his racist assessment of the corporate world and accepting his subordinate place. He told Julian that it was good to see a guy who actually understood his place in the food chain. He finally took his sweaty hand off Julian's shoulder and announced that he needed to go find Emily to prepare for the main toasts of the evening. He stumbled away back toward the bright lights of the center ballroom, leaving my father standing awkwardly at our table, breathing heavily. Calvin looked absolutely furious that Julian had not been more deferential and submissive to Spencer. My father leaned over the table and hissed at Julian, telling him he should have shown much more gratitude to a man who was clearly entirely out of his league. Calvin said Spencer was offering valuable industry insight, and that Julian was far too stubborn and proud to take good advice from his betters. My father claimed this arrogant attitude was exactly why Julian would never be truly wealthy or respected in proper circles. Calvin turned his angry glare to me and told me I should be deeply embarrassed by my husband's lack of ambition and his inability to network properly. Then my father stormed off to chase after Spencer, leaving us alone again in the dim shadows of the back table. I watched my father walk away, and I felt a wave of absolute exhaustion at his profound stupidity and self-hatred. He was so deeply committed to his own internalized racism and his desperate need for white validation that he would gladly let a mediocre, arrogant man insult his own family just to stay close to a perceived illusion of power. I turned to Julian and asked him how he managed to stay so incredibly calm and composed when someone was blatantly disrespecting him to his face and touching him with such condescension. Julian set his bourbon down on the white linen and reached across the table for my hand. His fingers traced the outline of my wedding ring. He told me that a lion does not bark back at a barking dog. He explained quietly that people like Spencer were nothing more than loud, insecure children playing dress-up in suits they bought on dangerous credit lines. He said true power does not ever need to announce itself at a country club engagement party to feel validated. True power moves in absolute silence and strikes when the target is completely unaware and defenseless. Julian told me he actually felt a brief fleeting moment of pity for Spencer, because the man was standing directly on a landmine and dancing happily to the music without realizing the detonator had already been triggered by the very people he was insulting. Grandma Beatrice let out a low whistle of appreciation and took a sip of her sweet iced tea. She looked at Julian with profound, unwavering respect. She said she had lived 80 difficult years on this earth and had seen many arrogant men run their mouths to ruin, but she had never in her life seen someone handle a loud fool with such terrifying grace and patience. She patted Julian's arm, and told him that he was exactly the kind of strong, silent man her brilliant granddaughter deserved to marry. She said the anticipation of watching Spencer and my parents face brutal reality tonight was the absolute best entertainment she had experienced in decades. I leaned back in my chair and surveyed the crowded ballroom one last time. As a forensic accountant, my entire job was to build a case piece by piece until the evidence was completely insurmountable and undeniable. Tonight was absolutely no different. Emily had shown her pathetic cards in the powder room, revealing her desperate financial ruin and fake designer lifestyle. Spencer had just shown his cards at our table, revealing his arrogant racist delusion and his complete lack of corporate awareness. My parents had shown their cards by validating the very parasites who were using them and insulting the only successful people who actually cared about them. The entire ballroom was a massive crime scene of emotional and financial fraud, and I was the lead investigator holding all the damning evidence in the palm of my hand. The catering staff began moving swiftly through the room, carrying heavy silver trays of overpriced food that my parents definitely could not afford to pay for. The lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly, signaling that the main events of the evening were about to begin. The hired DJ announced over the microphone that everyone should take their seats because the father of the bride and the groom-to-be were preparing to give their official toasts to the crowd. I watched Spencer swagger up to the small stage near the head table, holding a microphone in one hand and a fresh drink in the other. He looked like a man who believed he owned the entire world and everyone in it. I looked down at the dark screen of my iPad resting quietly inside my clutch purse. It contained the exact financial documents that would end his pathetic career and send him directly to a federal prison cell. I felt my heartbeat steady into a calm, rhythmic pulse. The casual racism and the corporate arrogance we had just endured were merely the final nails in his coffin. I took a deep breath and prepared myself for the speeches, knowing that the silence I had maintained for 31 years was about to be broken in the most spectacular and devastating way possible. The heavy velvet curtains near the main entrance were drawn shut, and the bright overhead chandeliers dimmed to a soft golden glow, signaling that the formal dinner portion of the evening was officially commencing. A small army of waiters in crisp white shirts flooded the ballroom floor, carrying large silver trays. They began placing plates of dry, overcooked filet mignon and wilted asparagus in front of the guests. As a forensic accountant who spent my life analyzing financial discrepancies, I could immediately tell that the country club was cutting massive corners on the catering package my parents had selected. They were presenting mediocre food on expensive gold-rimmed china to maintain the desperate illusion of luxury. I looked down at my plate and felt a deep wave of secondhand embarrassment. My parents had literally mortgaged their home to feed these people tough meat and cheap wine just to impress a room full of strangers who did not actually care about them. The hired DJ lowered the background music, and a sharp electronic feedback whine echoed through the tall speakers. Spencer was standing at the head table, tapping a silver butter knife against his crystal champagne flute to demand the absolute attention of the entire room. He stumbled slightly as he stepped up onto the small elevated stage, grabbing the microphone with a heavy, sweaty hand. His face was still flushed a patchy red from the enormous amount of alcohol he had consumed at the open bar. He looked out over the sea of rented tuxedos and fake smiles with the blind, towering confidence of a man who firmly believed his own ridiculous delusions. Spencer cleared his throat loudly into the microphone and began his speech. He did not start by thanking my parents for hosting this incredibly expensive gala. He did not start by talking about how much he loved Emily. He started by talking entirely about himself. He boasted about his incredible work ethic and his massive, supposedly undeniable success in the financial sector. He slurred his words slightly as he bragged to the silent room about his high-level position at Vanguard Capital. He claimed he was single-handedly driving the national market strategy for the entire firm. He proudly announced that due to his unmatched brilliance and his aggressive portfolio management, he was about to be officially promoted to the role of National Director of Investments by the end of the fiscal quarter. I sat in the dim lighting of the back corner table and listened to his pathetic lies echoing off the walls. My analytical mind immediately dissected every single fraudulent word falling out of his mouth. I knew for an absolute fact that his bank accounts were overdrawn. I knew his credit cards were completely maxed out. And more importantly, I knew he was not getting a promotion to National Director of Investments. I knew he was desperately trying to manifest a fake reality to keep his own parents and my parents from realizing he was completely broke. He stood on that stage making grand sweeping gestures, promising to buy Emily a massive mansion in the most exclusive zip code in the state. He painted himself as the ultimate provider, the wealthy white savior stepping down from his corporate throne to elevate our family into the upper echelons of high society. The crowd erupted into polite applause as Spencer raised his glass in a sloppy toast to his own fabricated greatness. His parents were sitting at the front table, beaming with false pride, masking their own crippling financial ruin behind tight practiced smiles. My mother, Brenda, was sitting next to them, acting like she had just won the ultimate lottery. She was clapping so hard, her hands must have hurt looking around the room to make sure everyone saw how important her new son-in-law was. Emily, however, was looking down at her lap, her fingers nervously twisting the white linen napkin. She knew the terrible truth about her designer dress and her fake lifestyle because I had shattered her illusion in the powder room just an hour ago. She looked terrified, like a passenger watching a train speed toward a broken bridge. Julian sat perfectly still beside me, sipping his tea and watching the man he had personally fired just 24 hours ago. My husband possessed a level of stoic restraint that was truly terrifying to behold. He watched Spencer brag about Vanguard Capital, knowing full well that Davenport Holdings had already acquired the firm and terminated Spencer's employment. Julian did not laugh or roll his eyes. He simply observed the chaotic desperation of a cornered rat. As the applause died down, my father Calvin pushed his chair back and walked up to the stage. His posture was stiff, and his movements were anxious. He took the microphone from Spencer, holding it carefully like it was a fragile religious relic. Calvin began to speak, and his voice trembled slightly with the overwhelming, crushing pressure of his own massive financial debt. He had sacrificed everything: his home, his savings, his dignity to pay for this single night, and he needed desperately to validate that terrible investment. Calvin started praising Spencer using coded language that made my stomach turn. He called Spencer a true visionary, an absolute titan of modern industry, and the exact epitome of a successful man. He spoke about Spencer's pedigree and his remarkable background, subtly worshipping the man's whiteness and his supposed generational wealth. Calvin told the quiet room that finding a man who truly understood the value of hard work and corporate dominance was rare, and that Spencer was exactly the kind of strong, capable leader that every father dreamed of having for a son-in-law. My father was completely abandoning his pride, groveling publicly to a man who was actively scamming him. But Calvin could not just leave it at praise. His deep-seated insecurity and his burning resentment required him to tear someone else down to make his own terrible choices feel justified. His eyes scanned the crowded ballroom, passing over the smiling faces of the guests, until his gaze locked directly onto our table in the dim back corner. The warm, fatherly expression melted off his face, instantly hardening into a mask of bitter, cold contempt. He gripped the microphone tightly, and his voice grew loud, defensive, and deliberately cruel. Calvin leaned into the microphone and told the entire ballroom that our family values men who create real wealth, not those who selfishly hoard it while their family struggles. The heavy, toxic implication hung in the air like a thick, suffocating blanket. He was calling my husband a broke, selfish hoarder, and he was publicly shaming me as a terrible daughter for not handing over my own hard-earned money to fund this ridiculous circus. The sheer, staggering audacity of the insult took my breath away. My father had taken out a second mortgage to feed his own vanity, and now he was standing on a stage insulting the only actual billionaire in the room for not paying his bills. Several guests who knew our family dynamic turned in their seats to look back at us. They were whispering behind their hands, eagerly consuming the toxic family drama my father had just served them on a silver platter. My mother was nodding vigorously in agreement with Calvin's insult, a smug, triumphant smile plastered across her face. She thought they had finally put me in my place. She thought they had publicly humiliated me and my quiet husband, proving once and for all that Emily had secured the better prize. Grandma Beatrice let out a low, angry hum in the back of her throat, her posture rigid with absolute disgust at her son's pathetic behavior. I did not flush with embarrassment. I did not look away in shame or shrink down into my chair. I simply looked down at my plate. I held my heavy silver fork between my fingers, feeling the cool, solid metal against my skin. I had spent 31 years swallowing their insults. I had spent my entire life sitting quietly in the background while they paraded their golden child and her fraudulent partner around like trophies. I had allowed them to diminish my career, mock my choices, and insult the brilliant, faithful man sitting beside me. I had tried to keep the peace by absorbing their constant psychological abuse. But the math had finally run its course. The ledger was balanced and the final tally showed nothing but absolute moral bankruptcy on their part. They had just crossed the final unforgivable boundary. They had publicly disrespected my husband to elevate a thief. I slowly opened my fingers and let the silver fork drop onto the fine porcelain plate. The sharp metallic clink rang out with a profound sense of absolute finality. It was a tiny sound, but to me it was the loudest noise in the world. It was the sound of the invisible chains finally breaking. I turned my head and looked at Julian. His dark eyes met mine steady and unwavering, holding a quiet storm of protective fury. I did not need to ask for his permission, but I wanted him to know what was about to happen. I gave him a single, nearly imperceptible nod. The corner of his mouth curved up into a cold, beautiful smile, and he nodded back, granting me complete total authority to burn their fake empire to the ground. I reached into my structured leather clutch resting on the chair beside me. My fingers closed around the smooth, cool casing of my digital tablet. I pulled it out and tapped the screen, waking up the device that held 3 months of meticulous forensic investigation. I stood up from the table, my emerald green dress falling perfectly into place. I pushed my chair back, the sound scraping softly against the polished floor. I did not feel any fear or hesitation. I only felt the freezing, absolute precision of a predator stepping out of the shadows. The time for silence. The time for taking the high road. The time for protecting my parents. Fragile egos was officially over. I began walking slowly and deliberately through the crowded tables, heading straight toward the center stage where the liars were standing. I left my table in the dark corner of the ballroom and began walking through the maze of white linen-covered tables and expensive floral centerpieces. The heavy bass from the speakers vibrated through the polished wooden floorboards, but my footsteps felt entirely weightless. I watched the faces of my extended family members and my parents' superficial friends as I passed them by. They looked confused and slightly annoyed. Some of them whispered to each other from behind their crystal champagne flutes, wondering why the quiet disappointment of the family was suddenly marching toward the front of the room during her father's grand speech. Calvin saw me approaching from the corner of his eye, and his smug, triumphant expression instantly faltered. He gripped the microphone tightly, his knuckles turning white, probably assuming I was coming up to the stage to make a deeply emotional scene or to demand a pathetic public apology for his insulting toast. He had absolutely no idea that I was not there to ask for anything. I was there to execute a controlled and absolute demolition of his entire fake empire. I completely bypassed the small elevated stage where my father and Spencer were standing and walked directly over to the audiovisual control station, positioned in the deep shadows near the front corner of the ballroom. A young venue technician was standing there half asleep, wearing a cheap black vest and monitoring the laptop that was currently projecting a massive slideshow of Emily and Spencer onto the giant screen behind the head table. The screen was cycling through heavily edited photos of them kissing on rented yachts, drinking champagne in expensive restaurants, and showing off the massive diamond ring that was currently financed on a predatory credit plan. I did not say a single word to the young technician. I simply reached out and pulled the main video cable directly out of the side of his laptop. The giant screen behind my father instantly went completely black. The sudden jarring darkness on the main stage caused a ripple of confusion to sweep through the entire ballroom. People stopped eating their dry steaks and lowered their forks. The whispers in the room grew noticeably louder. Calvin tapped the microphone frantically, the heavy thudding sound echoing through the tall speakers. He angrily demanded that the audio team fix the projector immediately, because the presentation was not over yet, and he had more important things to say about his brilliant future son-in-law. The technician panicked and tried to grab the cable back from my hand, but I simply looked at him with a freezing clinical stare that made him freeze in his tracks and take a slow step backward. I took the video cable and smoothly plugged it into the digital adapter, connected directly to my tablet. I tapped the glass screen and bypassed my security passcodes, opening the highly encrypted financial file I had been meticulously compiling for the past 3 months. I took a slow, deliberate breath and swiped my finger across the glass, sending my private investigation directly to the main projector. The giant screen behind the head table illuminated the ballroom once again, but it was no longer displaying fake engagement photos or smiling faces. It was displaying a massive, incredibly complex, and totally undeniable financial flowchart. The background of the slide was stark white, and it was covered in sharp red and black connecting lines linking various corporate logos, offshore bank routing numbers, and anonymous shell company registrations. The text on the screen was massive, bold, and impossible for anyone in the room to ignore. At the very top of the diagram was the official corporate logo for Vanguard Capital. Directly below it, a thick red arrow pointed to a fake vendor account labeled Apex Global Consulting. From there, a web of descending lines showed millions of dollars being sliced into smaller, unnoticeable transactions and funneled through international wire transfers. At the very bottom of the massive flowchart in large, bold letters was Spencer's full legal name, directly connected to 3 private offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands. The entire ballroom fell into a dead, confused silence, the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that precedes a massive and destructive storm. Spencer turned his body around slowly and looked up at the giant screen behind him. His red, flushed face immediately drained of all color, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost trapped inside a rented tuxedo. His mouth fell open and his eyes widened in absolute sheer panic. The heavy crystal glass he was holding slipped from his sweaty fingers and crashed onto the wooden stage, shattering into dozens of sharp pieces and sending amber liquid splashing across the polished floor. He recognized the names of the fake consulting companies and the exact routing numbers on the screen because he was the one who had created them to steal money from his employers. Emily stared up at the flowchart with a blank, confused expression. She lacked the basic financial literacy required to understand what she was looking at, but she could feel the sudden terrifying shift in the atmosphere of the room. She looked at Spencer, expecting him to laugh it off or explain the strange business presentation, but Spencer was literally trembling, his chest heaving as he stared at his own financial crimes broadcasted in high definition for 200 guests to see. Spencer's parents, who were sitting at the front table, completely stopped breathing. His father squinted at the screen and read the words offshore embezzlement out loud, his voice cracking with sudden terror. Their arrogant, confident posture completely evaporated. They knew their son was funding their lifestyle, but they had willfully ignored where the sudden influx of cash was coming from. Now the undeniable truth was glowing brightly right in front of their faces, and they realized they were deeply implicated in a massive federal crime. Calvin stared at the screen and then looked down at me standing by the control station, his face twisted in deep, angry confusion. He leaned into the microphone and loudly demanded to know what this garbage was telling me to turn the engagement photos back on immediately before I ruined the most important night of my sister's life. My mother, Brenda, stood up from her chair at the front table, her face contorted with rage, screaming at the venue staff to cut the power to the projector and calling me a jealous, spiteful liar who was trying to sabotage her perfect family. I did not listen to my father, and I completely ignored my mother's screaming. I unplugged my tablet, carrying it with me as I stepped away from the audiovisual station. I walked confidently up the 3 small wooden stairs onto the elevated stage. The sound of my heels clicking against the floorboards was steady and perfectly rhythmic. I walked right up to Calvin and calmly reached out my hand. He was so profoundly shocked by my blatant physical defiance and the sheer coldness in my eyes that he instinctively let go of the microphone. I wrapped my fingers around the cold metal grip and turned to face the entire ballroom of fake social climbers, greedy parasites, and toxic family members. The microphone amplified my breathing for a split second before I spoke. I did not yell over the rising murmurs of the crowd. I did not sound angry, bitter, or hysterical. I spoke with the freezing, calculated precision of a lead forensic investigator presenting lethal, irrefutable evidence in a federal courtroom. I knew that raising my voice would only give them an excuse to call me emotional or unstable. Speaking with absolute emotionless authority was the only way to ensure that every single word sliced through their delusions and pinned them directly to reality. I looked directly at my father first. He was standing just a few feet away from me, his chest heaving with anger and confusion. I told him through the microphone that he had just given a beautiful, passionate speech about the profound importance of creating real wealth. I told him that he had just publicly shamed my husband for supposedly hoarding resources while our family struggled to maintain their fragile social status. I told Calvin that it was incredibly ironic that he valued hard work so much, considering he was currently attempting to secure his retirement by marrying his favorite daughter off to a corporate thief. Calvin's mouth opened to argue, but no sound came out because the sheer weight of my confidence completely paralyzed him. Then I turned my body slowly and locked my eyes directly onto Spencer. The man who had just minutes ago patted my billionaire husband on the back and offered him condescending racist advice about climbing the corporate ladder was now gripping the edge of the head table so hard his knuckles were completely white. He was sweating profusely, a thick bead of moisture rolling down the side of his pale face and soaking into the collar of his expensive shirt. He looked like an animal caught in a snare, desperately searching the room for an exit that did not exist. I lifted the microphone closer to my mouth, ensuring that my voice would echo perfectly across the silent, cavernous room, cutting through the heavy, suffocating tension like a surgical blade. I pointed directly at the massive illuminated flowchart glowing on the screen behind us, ensuring that every single guest in the room followed my gesture and looked at the exact monetary figures I had uncovered during 3 months of relentless, exhausting audits. I had traced every single wire transfer, decrypted every hidden vendor invoice, and mapped the entire architecture of his pathetic, greedy fraud. "Speaking of creating real wealth, Spencer," I said, my voice perfectly steady, clear and echoing through the speakers without a single trace of hesitation. "Would you like to explain to my family the $4.5 million you have quietly embezzled from Vanguard Capital into 3 shell companies in the Cayman Islands?" The absolute silence in the grand ballroom lasted for exactly 3 seconds. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a bomb dropping right before the shockwave obliterates everything in its path. I stood on the elevated stage with the microphone resting loosely in my hand, watching the exact moment the collective delusion of my family finally shattered. Then the room completely erupted. It started with Spencer. The fake investment director let out a guttural sound that was half scream and half sob. He began violently shaking his head back and forth, as if the physical motion could somehow erase the massive financial flowchart glowing on the screen behind him. He stumbled backward away from the head table, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the spilled champagne from his broken glass. He started shouting profanities at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. He pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed that I was a psychotic liar, that I had hacked his personal accounts and fabricated the entire presentation just to ruin his life. His carefully constructed mask of white corporate superiority melted away, completely revealing the desperate, cornered thief underneath. Spencer's parents immediately jumped up from their front row seats, knocking their expensive wooden chairs backward onto the polished floor. His father, whose face was now a dangerous shade of purple, began pointing aggressively at the stage. He yelled over the rising chaos of the ballroom, threatening to sue me for every single penny I was worth. He screamed that this was a massive defamation of character and that his son was an honest, hard-working executive who was being targeted by a jealous, bitter woman. Spencer's mother clutched her outdated pink sequin gown and started demanding that the venue security arrest me immediately for slander. They were putting on a spectacular performance of righteous indignation, but as a forensic investigator, I could see the sheer terror hiding behind their loud threats. They knew their son was funding their fake luxury lifestyle, and they knew that if he went down for embezzlement, their entire financial house of cards would collapse with him. The other guests in the ballroom were in an absolute uproar. People were pulling out their smartphones, recording the catastrophic breakdown of the engagement gala. The wealthy socialites my parents had desperately tried to impress were now treating our family like a spectacular reality television train wreck. Emily was standing near the edge of the stage, frozen in a state of profound shock. She was not looking at the financial documents proving her fiancé was a federal criminal. She was looking around at the guests, watching her perfect high society image burn to ashes. She buried her face in her hands and started wailing loudly, crying over her ruined party, rather than the fact that she was about to marry a man facing years in federal prison. But it was my mother, Brenda, who reacted with the most vicious and desperate cruelty. She could not process the fact that the wealthy white savior she had worshipped was actually a fraud. Her brain simply refused to accept that her ultimate social trophy was a mirage. Instead, her mind instantly did what it had done for 31 years. It blamed me. Brenda let out a shrill, furious scream that cut right through the noise of the ballroom. She hiked up the skirt of her expensive dress and lunged toward the wooden stairs of the stage. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, absolute hatred. She rushed up the steps. Her eyes locked dead onto me. She screamed that I was a jealous, miserable liar who could not stand to see my younger sister happy. She yelled that I had fabricated these completely ridiculous financial documents because my own wedding was just a pathetic courthouse joke, and I wanted to drag Emily down to my miserable level. I did not step back. I did not flinch or raise my hands to protect myself. I just stood there looking at the woman who gave birth to me, watching her completely lose her mind, trying to protect a thief while attacking her own flesh and blood. She raised her hand as if she was actually going to strike me right there on the stage in front of 200 people, but she never got the chance. Julian moved. He did not run or rush. He moved with the freezing, calculated precision of a predator stepping directly into the line of fire. My husband appeared on the stage so smoothly and quietly it was almost terrifying. In one fluid motion, he positioned his tall, broad frame entirely between my mother and me, forming an impenetrable physical shield. The quiet, unassuming man, who had sat patiently in the back corner of the room all evening, completely vanished. His posture straightened to its full height, and the polite smile he had worn to humor my toxic family was instantly replaced by an aura of ruthless, staggering power. He looked down at my mother with eyes so dark and cold they could have frozen the entire room. "Do not raise your voice at my wife." Julian spoke the words softly, but his voice carried a weight and authority that commanded absolute obedience. It was the voice of a man who commanded boardrooms, who liquidated massive corporations before lunch, who never had to ask for respect because he naturally demanded it. My mother froze instantly. Her hand dropped to her side and she physically shrank backward away from Julian. The raw, overwhelming dominance radiating from him completely paralyzed her. She opened her mouth to argue to defend her precious son-in-law, but the words died in her throat. Calvin, who had rushed up the stairs behind my mother, stopped dead in his tracks. My father stared at Julian, finally realizing that the man he had insulted and belittled all evening was completely and utterly out of his league. Julian did not even wait for my parents to process their humiliation. He turned his body slowly away from them and locked his freezing gaze directly onto Spencer. The fraudulent investment director was leaning heavily against the head table, still sweating profusely and muttering weak threats about calling his legal team. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. The frantic shouting and whispering faded away, replaced by a heavy, waiting silence. Everyone could feel the monumental shift in the atmosphere. Julian took one slow, deliberate step toward Spencer. He placed his hands casually into the pockets of his custom-tailored trousers. He looked at the sweating, terrified man and spoke in a voice that was perfectly calm, clear, and devastatingly precise. Julian told Spencer that he recalled their very interesting conversation from earlier in the evening. He calmly reminded Spencer of the arrogant, racially coded advice he had offered at our dinner table. Julian repeated Spencer's exact words, reminding him how he had bragged about the corporate restructuring at Vanguard Capital, and how he had so graciously advised Julian to keep grinding in hopes of climbing the corporate ladder. Spencer swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He tried to maintain his arrogant posture, but his hands were shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the table to stay upright. He stammered, asking Julian who the hell he thought he was. Julian smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of an executioner pulling the lever. He told Spencer that it was a real shame he had been so busy drinking at the open bar and bragging about fake real estate investments all evening. Julian said that if Spencer had actually bothered to check his secure corporate email, he would have seen the internal company-wide memo that went out yesterday morning. Julian let the pause hang in the air, ensuring that every single person in the room was hanging on to his next sentence. He looked dead at Spencer and said, "You mentioned Vanguard Capital's recent layoffs, but you forgot to read the most important memo of your pathetic career. Davenport Holdings acquired Vanguard Capital yesterday morning." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Spencer's parents sank back into their chairs, their faces entirely devoid of hope. Calvin let out a choked, wheezing sound as his brain finally connected the dots. He had literally spent the entire night insulting the billionaire owner of Davenport Holdings to his face. Spencer opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. Julian took one final step forward, closing the distance until he was standing mere inches away from the trembling thief. Julian lowered his voice slightly, but the microphone on the table picked up every single lethal syllable. "I am your new boss." Julian stated his tone, dropping the temperature of the room by 10 degrees. "And I am a man who heavily values real wealth and absolute integrity over cheap suits and racist arrogance." Spencer tried to back away, but his legs hit the chairs behind him. He looked up at the giant financial flowchart glowing on the screen above them, and then looked back down at the ruthless billionaire standing in front of him. Julian delivered the final nuclear strike with absolute effortless grace. He informed Spencer that the corporate restructuring was indeed brutal, just as Spencer had warned him earlier. Julian calmly stated that he had personally reviewed the forensic accounting files my brilliant wife had compiled. He said he found the evidence of the Cayman Islands shell companies extremely thorough and entirely undeniable. Julian looked Spencer right in the eyes and delivered the fatal blow. He said, "I personally signed your official termination papers and executed the referral to the Federal Bureau of Investigation exactly 1 hour ago." The silence that followed was absolute and profound. There were no more threats of lawsuits from Spencer's parents. There were no more screams from my mother about my jealousy. There was only the staggering, undeniable reality of absolute destruction. Spencer collapsed. He did not just sit down, he physically crumbled. His knees gave out completely, and he slid down the front of the head table, landing in a pathetic heap on the floor of the stage, right next to the shattered remains of his champagne glass. He put his head between his knees and started hyperventilating the reality of his impending federal prison sentence crushing him under its immense weight. I stood behind Julian, watching the devastation with pure clinical satisfaction. The man who had tried to build an empire on stolen money and racial superiority was now crying on the floor, stripped of his title, his wealth, and his fake prestige. My parents, who had eagerly sold their souls and mortgaged their home to worship this fraud, were standing frozen on the stage, watching their golden ticket turn into dust. Julian turned back to me, offering his arm. The ruthless CEO mask faded slightly, replacing it with the warm, protective husband I loved. I placed my hand on his arm, letting him lead me away from the trembling, pathetic mess on the stage. We had delivered the facts. We had dropped the bomb. And now we were going to let the parasites turn on each other in the burning wreckage of their own making. We stepped down from the elevated stage, leaving the trembling wreckage of my family behind us, as the heavy, suffocating silence of the grand ballroom finally shattered. Julian guided me gently by the arm, his presence a solid anchor in the chaotic storm we had just unleashed. We did not walk toward the exit doors just yet. We stopped a few feet away, standing quietly in the dim shadows of the room to watch the absolute destruction of their carefully curated lies. I leaned against my husband, feeling the steady, calm rhythm of his breathing. We had delivered the fatal blow with forensic precision, but I knew the real punishment was what these desperate people were about to do to each other, now that the truth was blindingly illuminated on the giant screen above them. Emily was the first to break the frozen tableau on the stage. She did not rush to comfort the man she supposedly loved, who was now facing years in a federal penitentiary. She looked down at her expensive white designer dress and began crying hysterically over the fact that her perfect high society party was permanently ruined. She looked at Spencer, who was still sitting pathetically on the polished wooden floor among the shards of his broken champagne glass, and told him he was a disgusting loser who had completely humiliated her in front of all her important friends. She demanded to know how he could be so incredibly stupid to get caught and ruin her future as a wealthy corporate wife. That was the exact moment Spencer's terror morphed into pure, unadulterated rage. He realized his entire life was completely over. His lucrative career at Vanguard Capital was dead. His social reputation was annihilated, and federal agents were likely already building a massive case against him based on the files I had provided to Julian. Spencer looked up at Emily with eyes full of absolute hatred. The charming, polite mask he wore to impress my parents melted away entirely. He scrambled to his feet, his face twisting into an ugly, vicious sneer. He did not apologize for lying to her or beg for her forgiveness. Instead, he lunged forward and pointed a shaking, sweaty finger right in her face. Spencer screamed that this entire disaster was completely her fault. His voice echoed loudly through the microphone that Calvin had abandoned on the table, projecting his toxic fury across the entire ballroom. He yelled that he never would have touched a single dime of Vanguard Capital funds if he was not drowning under the crushing weight of her pathetic, greedy expectations. He screamed that Emily and her ghetto gold-digging family had bled him completely dry from the very first moment they met. The words echoed off the high ceilings, hanging in the air like poison. Spencer told the entire room of shocked guests that my parents had constantly demanded expensive dinners, luxury vacations, and exclusive country club memberships to prove he was worthy of their precious daughter. He yelled that Emily had literally threatened to leave him if he did not buy a six-figure engagement ring to show off to her shallow, superficial friends. He said he was forced to create those offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands just to keep up with the absurd financial demands of a family that contributed absolutely nothing of value to society. Emily gasped, taking a sharp step backward as if she had been physically struck by his words. She shrieked that he was a liar and a cheap, pathetic fraud who was just trying to blame her for his own criminal behavior. My mother, Brenda, immediately snapped out of her paralyzed state of shock. Her maternal instincts finally kicked in, but only to protect her precious golden child from the harsh reality of the situation. Brenda marched right up to Spencer, her fancy emerald green dress swishing angrily around her ankles. She got right in his face, ignoring the fact that he was towering over her. She told him he was a worthless piece of trash and that he had completely ruined her family's pristine reputation in the community. She yelled that Emily was an absolute prize and that Spencer should have been deeply honored to spend every single dime he had to make her happy. The moment Brenda insulted Spencer, his own parents completely lost whatever fake high society manners they had left. The polite, wealthy white facade they had been hiding behind all evening melted away to reveal the broke, desperate scammers hiding underneath. Spencer's father stomped heavily up the short wooden stairs to the stage, his face red and sweating profusely under the bright lights. He yelled at my mother, telling her to shut her mouth and stop pretending she was some kind of elite aristocrat. He screamed that his son was the only reason anyone in this country club even looked twice at our family, and that we should have been grateful for his presence. The argument quickly devolved into a vicious, ugly screaming match that stripped away every single layer of my parents' beloved respectability politics. Spencer's mother joined the fight, clutching her outdated pink sequin dress as she climbed onto the stage. She looked at Brenda with pure venom and yelled that they had bent over backward to accept a black family into their exclusive social circle. She said they had tolerated my parents' desperate social climbing and their tacky behavior because they genuinely felt sorry for them. She screamed that her son was a brilliant financial executive whose life was now ruined because he got trapped by a manipulative girl who just wanted a free ride to the top. Calvin could not take the insult to his pride. My father, who had spent his entire life bowing down to white wealth and compromising his own dignity, stepped into the middle of the screaming circle. He puffed out his chest, trying to regain some semblance of control over the catastrophic situation. He yelled at Spencer's father, telling him that our family was independently wealthy and that we did not need anyone to elevate us in society. Calvin boasted loudly that he had personally paid for this entire lavish engagement party, while Spencer's family had not contributed a single cent to the celebration. Spencer let out a dark, hysterical laugh that sounded almost manic as it echoed through the microphone. He looked at Calvin and told him he was an absolute idiot. Spencer yelled that his own family was completely broke and drowning in massive debt. He confessed to the entire room that his father's real estate business had gone bankrupt 3 years ago and that they had been lying about their wealth ever since. He revealed that his parents' house was currently in active foreclosure and that they had been living entirely off the money he had been embezzling from Vanguard Capital. Spencer looked at my father with pure disgust and told him that his parents had only agreed to the engagement because they thought Calvin and Brenda were loaded and could eventually bail them out of their financial ruin. The profound realization hit the stage like a physical shockwave. My parents stared at Spencer's family in absolute horror as the truth finally clicked into place. Spencer's parents stared back with equal disgust and terror. It was a spectacular and poetic collision of two completely fraudulent worlds. My parents had sacrificed everything, including their relationship with their eldest daughter, to impress a white family they believed held the keys to high society and generational wealth. Spencer's family had tolerated my parents solely because they thought my parents had the massive financial resources required to save them from impending poverty. They were two broke, desperate families who had been actively trying to scam each other, all while living entirely on predatory credit cards and stolen corporate funds. The mutual parasitic relationship had just been exposed in front of 200 guests, and neither side had anywhere left to hide. The guests in the ballroom were absolutely captivated by the brutal honesty of the public meltdown. The wealthy socialites my parents had tried so incredibly hard to impress were now pointing, laughing, and openly recording the entire pathetic display on their phones. The illusion was completely dead and buried. Brenda realized that all her country club friends were watching her get exposed as a desperate broke social climber who had tried to marry her daughter off to a federal criminal. The shame and humiliation radiating from my mother was almost palpable in the air. She looked around the room, her eyes wide and frantic, realizing that her social standing in the community was permanently eradicated. As I watched my parents screaming at the very people they had practically worshipped just an hour ago, I felt a profound sense of vindication wash over me. Calvin had always told me that I needed to act a certain way to be accepted by the right kind of people. He had forced our family to swallow microaggressions and blatant disrespect in the name of upward mobility. He had sold his soul for a seat at a table that did not even exist. And now the right kind of people were standing on a stage screaming subtle racial slurs at him and calling his favorite daughter a gold-digging parasite. The beautiful irony was that Calvin had brought this tragedy entirely upon himself. If he had just attended my quiet, intimate wedding last Saturday, he would be sitting at a gorgeous private estate eating a 5-course meal with a billionaire son-in-law who actually respected him. Instead, he had taken out a second mortgage on his home to buy dry, overcooked steak for a room full of people who were currently laughing at his ultimate public disgrace. Emily was sobbing hysterically now, her hands pulling anxiously at her perfectly styled hair. She screamed at Spencer that she hated him and that he had permanently ruined her life. She yelled that she was going to have to return her expensive engagement dress tomorrow morning, and that she had already bragged to all her friends about the massive custom mansion he was supposedly going to buy her. Her concerns were so incredibly shallow that even in the midst of a massive federal crime being exposed, her only worry was how she would look on social media the next day. Spencer ignored her, completely turning his panicked rage back onto his own parents. He yelled at his father, blaming him for the immense financial pressure that drove him to steal from Davenport Holdings in the first place. He said he was absolutely sick of carrying the weight of their failed business and that they were just as greedy and pathetic as my parents were. The two families continued to tear each other apart, throwing insults and assigning blame, while completely ignoring the fact that they were all complicit in their own destruction. The screaming grew so loud and chaotic that the venue management finally had to intervene. The country club coordinator, a stern-looking woman holding a clipboard, marched up to the stage and demanded that they lower their voices immediately, or she would have the local authorities clear the ballroom for disturbing the peace. The threat of local police only added to Spencer's frantic terror, since the Federal Bureau of Investigation was already notified of his massive corporate fraud. He scrambled backward, looking wildly around the room for an exit, trying desperately to figure out how to escape the severe legal consequences of his actions. Brenda collapsed into a padded dining chair at the head table, burying her face in her hands and weeping loudly as her entire fake reality burned to the ground right in front of her eyes. Calvin stood there looking broken and utterly defeated, realizing that he had spent his entire life chasing an illusion that had just destroyed his family and his finances in one single night. Julian stood quietly beside me, his hand resting gently and protectively on the small of my back. We watched the parasites tear each other to shreds, consuming themselves in a massive fire, fueled entirely by their own greed and arrogance. There was absolutely no need for us to say another word or intervene in the argument. The cold, hard truth had done all the heavy lifting for us, and the results were more devastating than anything I could have ever imagined. The engagement party was over, and the reckoning had officially begun. The screaming on the stage finally began to die down, replaced by the pathetic sounds of heavy sobbing and the harsh fluorescent lights of the ballroom clicking on as the venue staff decided they had seen absolutely enough of the chaos. The romantic dim lighting was completely gone, exposing every single spilled drink, every overturned chair, and every terrified face in stark, unforgiving detail. Calvin stood in the center of the wreckage, looking around at the absolute ruins of his social climbing dreams. His eyes darted from the crying form of his youngest daughter to the hostile, furious faces of Spencer's fraudulent family, and finally his desperate gaze landed squarely on us. He realized in that exact moment that the wealthy white savior he had bet his entire life on was actually a federal criminal who was about to be hauled away in handcuffs. He realized that the country club friends he had tried so hard to impress had already started slipping out the side doors, eager to distance themselves from the catastrophic embarrassment of our family name. Calvin was completely out of options and completely out of time. He took a shaky step toward the back of the room where Julian and I were standing quietly in the shadows. His shoulders were slumped, and the arrogant, proud posture he had maintained for 31 years had completely vanished. He looked like a broken, terrified old man whose entire reality had just collapsed under his feet. Brenda noticed him moving toward us and immediately followed, trailing behind him like a frightened, desperate shadow. They approached us with their heads bowed, entirely stripped of the toxic superiority they had paraded around just an hour ago. Calvin stopped a few feet away from Julian, swallowing hard as he tried to find the courage to speak to a man he had deeply insulted all night. He did not look at me at first. He looked directly at my billionaire husband, seeing him not as a son-in-law, but as a massive walking bank vault that could miraculously save him from impending doom. Calvin raised his trembling hands, and his voice cracked heavily as he began to speak. He said, "Julian, please, you have to understand the immense crushing pressure we were under." He begged my husband to forgive the horrible things they had said, claiming they were just blinded by their desire to give Emily a proper high society life. Then the horrific truth of their financial desperation finally spilled out of his mouth. Calvin confessed to the entire room that he had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage on their home just to pay the non-refundable deposits for this extravagant party. He admitted that they had completely drained their meager retirement accounts and maxed out multiple high-interest credit cards to buy the dry steaks, the cheap champagne, and the ridiculous floral arrangements that were currently wilting on the tables around us. He looked up at Julian with tears streaming down his face and begged for a financial bailout. He said, "You have billions of dollars, Julian. You could write a check right now and save our house. You could save our family from total ruin. Please do not let us lose everything we have worked for." Brenda pushed her way forward, grabbing her husband's arm and sobbing loudly. She looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, completely abandoning her previous violent rage. She cried out, telling me that I was always her smart, capable daughter, and that she knew I would never let my own parents become homeless. She begged me to talk to Julian to convince him to transfer the funds to cover their massive debts. She swore that things would be different from now on, that they would respect me and treat me like the successful woman I had become. She tried to reach out and touch my arm, but I simply took a slow, deliberate step backward, keeping a freezing, absolute distance between us. I looked at the two people who had given birth to me and felt absolutely zero empathy in my chest. My forensic mind processed their tears, not as genuine remorse, but as the calculated panic of parasites who had just lost their primary host and were desperately trying to attach themselves to a new one. I did not look at Julian. I did not need to ask my husband for anything, because the financial destruction of my parents was a matter I had already personally handled a long time ago. I looked Calvin dead in the eyes, and my voice was perfectly flat and devoid of any emotional warmth. I asked my father if he truly believed that a man who creates real wealth should selfishly hoard it while his family struggles, repeating the exact insulting words he had used against Julian during his pathetic toast. Calvin flinched as the quote hit him squarely in the chest. He stammered a pathetic apology, saying he did not mean it, and that he was just trying to impress Spencer. I told him that his desperate need to impress a racist corporate thief had cost him his dignity, but his own staggering financial incompetence was what had actually cost him his home. Calvin looked deeply confused, his tear-filled eyes darting between me and Julian. He repeated that they were going to lose the house to the bank if they did not pay the second mortgage immediately. I let out a soft, cold laugh that made my mother physically shiver. I reached into my structured leather clutch purse, and my fingers found the crisp, folded sheet of paper I had been carrying all evening. I slowly pulled the document out and held it up in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the ruined ballroom. I asked my father if he remembered a specific holding company called Apex Capital. I watched his face closely as his brain tried to process the name through his panic. Calvin nodded slowly, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. He said yes. Apex Capital was the private investment firm that had swooped in and bought their bad debt when they were facing total foreclosure late last year. He said they had restructured the loan and allowed them to stay in the property. He had always bragged to his friends that a major corporate entity had seen the value in his real estate portfolio and saved them from the brink of disaster. I looked at him with a freezing clinical stare and shattered that specific delusion into a million tiny pieces. I told my father that Apex Capital was not a massive anonymous investment firm. I told him it was a private limited liability company that I had personally registered in the state of Delaware 3 years ago. I watched the exact moment the devastating reality crashed into his mind. His eyes widened in absolute horror as he stared at the crisp white paper in my hand. I spoke slowly, ensuring that every single word landed with maximum impact. I told him that I was the sole owner and managing director of Apex Capital. I told him that I was the one who had purchased his toxic bad debt when the bank was preparing to throw them out onto the street. I looked at the man who had ordered me to cancel my wedding and told him that I owned the very roof over his head. "You do not own a home, Dad," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet space. You are my tenants. Brenda let out a loud, terrified gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. She realized instantly that they had spent the entire year actively insulting and degrading the actual landlord who controlled their housing security. Calvin started hyperventilating his chest, heaving as he stared at the legal document in my hand. He tried to form a sentence, trying to say that, since I owned the house, everything would be fine and that I could just forgive the debt because we were blood family. I completely ignored his pathetic assumption. I unfolded the paper with sharp, precise movements and held it out directly toward his chest. I asked him if he remembered what he had done with his housing payment this month. I reminded him that instead of paying the monthly lease agreement to the holding company, he had selfishly diverted those specific funds to pay for the massive deposit on the country club ballroom and the cheap dry steaks sitting on the tables around us. He had literally used his rent money to fund Emily's fake high society engagement party. I pushed the paper against his expensive rented tuxedo jacket, forcing him to take it. Calvin's trembling fingers closed around the document. He looked down at the bold black text printed across the top of the page. It was not a loan forgiveness form. It was an official notarized 30-day notice of eviction. I told my father that since he had deliberately withheld the monthly payment to fund a fraudulent social event, he was in direct legal breach of our strict leasing contract. I told him that my holding company did not tolerate delinquent tenants who prioritized fake luxury over basic financial obligations. I looked at the man who had called my wedding a cheap courthouse transaction and told him he had exactly 30 days to pack all of his belongings and completely vacate my property. Brenda fell to her knees right there on the polished hardwood floor of the country club. She reached out and tried to grab the hem of my emerald green dress, sobbing hysterically and begging me not to make them homeless. She wailed that they had nowhere else to go, that they had completely ruined their credit and alienated all their friends. She screamed that Emily would not be able to help them because Spencer was going to prison and they would all be out on the street with absolutely nothing. I calmly stepped backward, ensuring her desperate, grasping hands did not touch the fabric of my dress. I looked down at her crying on the floor and felt absolutely nothing but a cold, quiet satisfaction. I told her that she should have thought about her housing security before she decided to worship a racist corporate thief and discard her own loyal daughter. I told her that actions have real, tangible consequences, and the consequence for choosing an illusion over reality was losing absolutely everything you have ever valued. Julian stepped forward, placing himself gently beside me. He did not say a single word to my parents. He did not need to. His silent, powerful presence was a massive, impenetrable wall that they could never cross again. I turned my body away from the sobbing mess of my mother on the floor and the completely broken, frozen shell of my father. I looked at the grand double doors of the ballroom leading out to the quiet, peaceful night. I did not look at Emily, who was still crying in the corner over her ruined designer dress. I did not look at Spencer, who was currently surrounded by venue security waiting for the local federal authorities to arrive and drag him away. I simply reached out and took my husband's arm, wrapping my hand securely around his warm, solid bicep. We began walking toward the exit. Our footsteps moved in perfect unison, steady and completely unbothered by the catastrophic wreckage we were leaving behind. The remaining guests parted silently to let us through, watching us with a mixture of profound shock and deep, terrified respect. No one dared to speak a word or block our path. We walked through the heavy oak doors of the country club, leaving the loud, toxic chaos of my biological family permanently sealed inside. The cool, crisp night air hit my face, feeling incredibly fresh and clean. The heavy, suffocating weight of 31 years of respectability, politics, conditional love, and desperate social climbing lifted off my shoulders entirely, evaporating into the dark, beautiful sky. A sleek, black chauffeured Rolls-Royce was idling quietly near the front entrance of the club, its polished surface gleaming perfectly under the outdoor security lights. The driver immediately stepped out and opened the heavy rear door for us, offering a polite, respectful nod. Julian guided me safely into the luxurious leather interior of the vehicle before sliding in right beside me. The door closed with a solid, reassuring thud, blocking out all remaining sounds of the outside world. As the car smoothly pulled away from the curb, gliding down the long, winding driveway of the golf course, Julian reached over and gently intertwined his fingers with mine. He looked at me in the dim, ambient light of the back seat, his dark eyes filled with absolute profound love and quiet pride. I leaned my head against his shoulder, watching the country club disappear from view in the tinted side mirror. I was a forensic accountant who had finally balanced the ultimate emotional ledger. The massive toxic debt of my past was completely written off, and I was driving toward a brilliant, authentic future, perfectly whole and completely free. The most profound lesson from this story is that your worth is never determined by people who refuse to see your value, even if those people are your biological family. When you spend your life trying to please toxic individuals who only care about superficial status, you end up sacrificing your own peace. True power comes from setting absolute boundaries and walking away from anyone who treats you like an option. You do not need to prove your success to people who constantly belittle you. The greatest victory is building an authentic life, surrounded by people who genuinely respect you, and leaving the parasites behind to face the consequences of their own choices. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic people to protect your own peace? Let me know your story in the comments below and subscribe for more empowering content.